Queen Ifechi loved sitting by the river. It was her favorite place. The water was calm, the air was cool, and the sound of the river made her feel at peace. She would go there to think, to relax, and to be alone. On this day, her belly was big, very big. She was 9 months pregnant, and the baby could come any day. She sat by the river, enjoying the peace. But then, suddenly, she felt a sharp pain. Her heart jumped. She held her stomach and cried out, "Oh no!" The baby was coming. She screamed, hoping someone would hear her. "Help me," she shouted. But no one came. She was all alone. The pain got worse. It was so strong that she could barely move. She fell to the ground, clutching her belly, crying and groaning. There, by the river, Queen Ifechi gave birth to the baby all by herself. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. The pain was unbearable, but she did it. Finally, the baby came out. She gasped for air, weak but relieved. She looked down at her child, ready to feel joy and love. But when she saw the baby, she froze. Her eyes grew wide, and her mouth opened in shock. The baby was white. Not light-skinned. Not pale. Completely white, like snow. Queen Ifechi could not believe it. She stared at the baby, her mind racing. "How is this possible?" she whispered. She was dark-skinned. The king was dark-skinned. How could she have a white baby? Fear grabbed her heart. The king will never believe me, she thought. He will think I cheated on him. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she held the baby close. What will I do? What will I say? The king, King Uju, was a proud, arrogant, and angry man. He was not kind. People feared him. No one dared to question him, not even the closest woman to his heart, Queen Ifechi. If the king thought she had betrayed him, he would punish her. He might even end her life. He would never accept this child. Her hands shook as she looked at the baby. "I cannot take you to the palace," she whispered. Her voice broke with sadness. "The king will not let you live. I have no choice." With a heavy heart, Queen Ifechi wrapped the baby in a soft cloth. She walked to the edge of the river, her legs weak and her chest tight. She placed the baby gently in the water. The river was calm, and it carried the baby slowly away. "I am sorry," she said, her voice shaking. "I am so sorry." Tears streamed down her face as she watched the baby drift away. But she could not stay there. She had to act quickly. She couldn't return with no pregnancy and no baby. She wiped her tears and sneaked to the orphanage in the far corner of the kingdom. At the orphanage, an old woman greeted her. "Please," Queen Ifechi begged. "I need a baby. I will pay you anything. But you must promise never to tell anyone I was here." The old woman looked at her with kind eyes and handed her a baby boy. He was healthy, dark-skinned, and perfect. Queen Ifechi held the baby close and sighed with relief. She left quickly, thanking the woman and making her promise to stay silent. When Queen Ifechi returned to the palace with the baby, there was celebration everywhere. The servants clapped and cheered. The people sang songs. The king smiled proudly. Everyone was happy. They named the baby Arinze. But Queen Ifechi was not happy. She smiled for the people and held the baby like a loving mother. But inside, her heart was heavy. She could not stop thinking about the baby she had left in the river. Her secret was safe, for now. But secrets do not stay hidden forever. One day, this secret would come back, and it would change everything. While Queen Ifechi left the river, the baby she abandoned floated on. The baby cried and cried, his small voice filled with sadness. But his mother was already gone, far from the river. Soon, the baby began to sink, his tiny arms flailing as the water rose around him. Just then, a figure appeared in the water. It was a mermaid. Her name was Queen Miri, the wise and powerful ruler of the Mermaid Kingdom. She saw the baby sinking and rushed to save him. Her long, shiny tail sparkled as she swam swiftly to the child. She lifted him up just in time. Who would leave such a beautiful child here? Queen Miri asked aloud. She looked around, hoping to find the baby's mother. Her eyes scanned the riverbank, but there was no one there. The baby kept crying in her arms, his small hands reaching out. Queen Miri sighed. "Since no one is here, I will take you with me," she said. She cradled the baby and swam down to her underwater kingdom. But as soon as she went underwater, the baby began to choke. His little body shook, and his face turned pale. "Oh no!" Queen Miri said, her heart racing. She suddenly remembered that humans cannot breathe underwater. She leaned down and kissed the baby softly on his forehead. The kiss was magical. The baby gasped and took a deep breath. Suddenly, he stopped choking and started breathing underwater. His tiny legs shimmered and turned into a shiny silver tail. The baby had transformed into a mermaid. Queen Miri smiled. "You are one of us now," she said gently. When she brought the baby to her kingdom, all the mermaids gathered around to see him. They had never seen anyone like him before. His skin was pure white, glowing softly in the water. The mermaids whispered among themselves. "He is so different," one said. "Look how bright he is," another added. Queen Miri held the baby close. "I will name him Prince Callow," she said proudly. The mermaids all nodded, and the name spread quickly through the kingdom. Prince Callow was now part of their family. Queen Miri had a daughter named Princess Decca. She was kind, playful, and loved taking care of others. When she saw Prince Callow, she smiled brightly. She loved him at once, as if he were her little brother. She stayed by his side, playing with him and keeping him safe. As time passed, something strange began to happen. The Mermaid Kingdom started to change. The coral reefs, which had been fading, suddenly turned bright and colorful. The underwater plants grew taller and greener. Even the water sparkled like never before. The entire kingdom felt alive and full of energy. The mermaids noticed the change. "Everything is growing so beautifully," they said. "It must be because of Prince Callow," another added. Queen Miri watched her kingdom in awe. "This has never happened before," she said. "Prince Callow is special." As Prince Callow grew older, he amazed everyone. He learned quickly and always wanted to know more. The mermaids taught him to swim like lightning, speak their language, and defend the kingdom. In no time, he became the best fighter among them. He moved through the water like a warrior, fast and fearless. "Look at him," the mermaids would say. "He is a true prince." Even though he was the only boy in the kingdom, everyone loved him. They saw him as their protector and their hope for the future. Princess Decca treated him like her own brother, and they became inseparable. For 15 years, King Uju lived happily, believing Prince Arinze was his real son. He loved him like a true father, but the boy was arrogant just like his father. Queen Ifechi, too, was happy. Her big secret was hidden, and no one ever suspected the truth. Life in the palace seemed perfect. But King Uju had one wish that never came true. He wanted another child. But no matter what he did, Queen Ifechi never got pregnant again. One evening, as the sun set, Queen Ifechi saw the king sitting alone in the courtyard. His face was serious, and he looked deep in thought. She walked over to him and said softly, "My king, why do you look so troubled? Isn't one child enough for us?" The king looked at her, his face hard to read. "One child is enough," he said slowly. "But I am waiting for someone." Queen Ifechi's heart skipped a beat. "Who are you waiting for, my king?" she asked carefully, trying not to sound too curious. The king's eyes narrowed, and his voice grew firm. This is not something a woman should ask about. You are supposed to be in the chamber, he said sharply. Queen Ifechi lowered her head. Yes, my king, she said quietly. She knew better than to ask more questions. The king did not like to be questioned, even by her. But inside, she was scared. Who is he waiting for? What does he mean? She couldn't stop thinking about it. A cold fear crept into her heart. What if the person he is waiting for is the child I left by the river? The thought made her chest tighten. For years, she had tried to forget about the baby she had abandoned. But now, her past seemed to be creeping back. Prince Arinze, meanwhile, lived his life with a strict and arrogant father. The people of the kingdom didn't like him. They didn't blame him. To them, it was because of his father. He had his father's pride and arrogance. One night, Queen Ifechi sat alone in her room. The palace was quiet, but her thoughts were loud. She remembered the day at the river, the baby's cries, the way the water carried him away. She wondered, did he survive? Did someone find him? Could he still be alive? And then the most terrifying thought came to her. What if he is the one the king is waiting for? Her heart felt heavy with fear and guilt. She had made the hardest decision to protect herself. But now, it felt like her past was coming back to destroy her. King Uju could not sleep. He walked up and down in his chambers, thinking hard. The thought of what he was expecting troubled him. The king had been reading the old scrolls about their kingdom's history to confirm his suspicions. Every 200 years, a special child was born. This child was not like other children. The child was sent by the gods and born with pure white skin. This child was a gift, bringing strength and good fortune to the kingdom. When the child was in the kingdom, no enemies dared to attack, and the people lived in harmony. These were the best times in the kingdom's history. The scrolls said this child always came every 200 years. But now, the king was confused and worried. It had been 200 years since the last child, and he was supposed to come in his reign. Yet, he had not seen this special gift. Queen Ifechi, sitting in her room, was shaking with fear. What if he finds out about the baby I left by the river? She thought. Her heart raced. The secret she had kept for 15 years felt like a heavy stone in her chest. The king decided to seek answers. He called for the chief priest, the wisest man in the kingdom, to help him. The chief priest arrived quickly. His face was calm, but his presence carried great power. The priest lit some herbs and began chanting. His voice was deep and steady as he called upon the gods. Smoke filled the room, and the air grew thick with tension. The king watched closely, his heart pounding with hope and fear. Finally, the chief priest stopped. He opened his eyes and spoke. "Your Majesty," he said, "the child has been born." The king frowned, confused. "What do you mean the child has been born?" he asked. "We have not seen any such child." The chief priest nodded. "The gods have spoken clearly. The special child has been born." The king's face grew dark with anger. "What are you saying?" he demanded. "If the child is born, why is he not here with me? Where is he?" The priest lowered his voice. "Your Majesty, the gods say the child lives." The king's anger boiled over. His mind raced with thoughts. "Who has taken what is mine?" he shouted. "Who dares to keep this child from me?" The priest stood silent, letting the king's anger settle. "The gods have given their gift, but now it is up to you to find him," he said. Meanwhile, Queen Ifechi sat in her chambers, trembling with fear. She overheard whispers about the king's meeting with the priest. She felt the walls of her secret life closing in on her. What if they find out? What will happen to me? The king's mind was heavy with anger and suspicion. He called for his wife, Queen Ifechi, to come to him. She entered the royal chambers, her heart racing with fear. She could see the anger in the king's eyes, and her legs felt weak. "Sit down," the king commanded, his voice cold and sharp. Queen Ifechi obeyed, sitting slowly. Her hands trembled as she folded them in her lap. "Does he know?" she thought, her mind racing. "Has he found out about the child?" The king's gaze was hard and piercing. "Tell me," he began, his voice low and steady. "The baby you gave birth to, was he like this?" Queen Ifechi hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes, my king," she said softly. But the king did not believe her. He noticed how her hands shook and how her voice wavered. Her eyes refused to meet his. "You are lying," he said, his voice growing louder. "I'm not, my king," Queen Ifechi said, her voice barely above a whisper. The king's patience snapped. He slammed his hand on the table and roared, "Speak up! Tell me the truth!" Queen Ifechi jumped in fear, her heart pounding. She could no longer hold back. Tears streamed down her face as she began to confess. She told the king everything, how she had given birth to a white-skinned baby, how she feared he would not accept the child, and how she had abandoned him by the river. The king listened, his face growing darker with every word. His anger was like a storm, ready to explode. "You abandoned the gift of the gods," he shouted, his voice shaking the walls. "You betrayed me in this kingdom." The chief priest, who was standing nearby, stepped forward carefully. "Your Majesty," he said in a calm voice, "what the queen did was wrong, very wrong. But please, do not act in extreme anger. She did this out of fear. Fear of you." The king's eyes blazed with fury. "Fear of me?" he shouted. "Yes, my king," the priest continued. "Not just her. The entire kingdom fears your wrath. This does not excuse her actions, but—" The king cut him off with a roar. "Enough! One more word from you, and you will face the same punishment as her." The chief priest stepped back, his head bowed. He did not dare to speak again. The king ordered his guards to prepare a search party. They went to the river where Queen Ifechi had abandoned the child 15 years ago. The water was calm, and the area was quiet. They searched for hours, but there was no sign of the child. "How could he still be here after 15 years?" the king muttered, frustration clear in his voice. The chief priest closed his eyes, trying to sense the child's presence. "He is not dead, Your Majesty," the priest said finally. "I can feel his spirit. It is strong. He must still be alive, and he might be in the underworld, I mean the mermaids." The king frowned deeply. "The mermaids?" "Yes, my king," the priest replied. "The child was taken into the water. The mermaids must have him." The king's fists clenched. He turned and stormed back to the palace with his guards, anger boiling in his chest. When they arrived, he dismissed the chief priest without another word. As for Queen Ifechi, the king ordered her to be locked in the palace dungeons. "Let her stay there until I decide her fate," he said coldly. The queen was dragged away, tears streaming down her face. She had lived with the secret for 15 years, but now it had all come crashing down. The king also put Prince Arinze with his mother in the prison. People in the palace were confused because it wasn't the prince's fault. But nobody dared to say anything. They already knew him as a heartless king. King Uju was very angry. He called his personal advisors to discuss what to do next. The advisors entered the room slowly, fear on their faces. They all knew the king's temper. They had to choose their words carefully because, no matter what they said, the king always did what he wanted. The king sat on his throne, his hands clenched into fists. "The mermaids have my son," he shouted. "How dare they keep him from me? I will go to war with them if they don't return him." One of the advisors, trying to stay calm, spoke softly. "Your Majesty," he said, "please think about this. The mermaids saved the child. Without them, he would have been lost forever. Maybe we can ask them peacefully to return him." The king's eyes narrowed, but he nodded slowly. "Fine," he said. "We will ask. But they must obey me." The king grabbed a scroll and began to write. His hand moved quickly as he wrote his demands. When he finished, he read the letter aloud. "To the mermaids. You have my son, the prince of this kingdom. Return him to me within 3 days, or I will bring my wrath upon you. King Uju." One of the advisors stepped forward, nervous but brave. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "please forgive me, but the letter sounds harsh. Maybe we should write it more kindly, so they will." The king slammed his fist on the table, making everyone jump. "How dare you tell me how to write my letter?" he shouted. "You are my advisor. I am the king. I make the decisions." The advisor quickly bowed his head. "Yes, Your Majesty," he said, stepping back. The room went silent. The other advisors looked at each other but said nothing. They were too afraid to speak. The king rolled up the letter and placed it in a small glass bottle. He called for his messenger. "Take this to the river, deliver it to the mermaids," he commanded. The messenger bowed and left with the bottle. When he reached the river, the messenger pulled out a small flute. He blew into it, and a soft, clear sound echoed over the water. Then, he threw the bottle into the river and hurried away. A few minutes after the messenger left, some mermaids swimming nearby saw the bottle floating in the water. One swam closer and picked it up. She turned it around in her hands, curious. "What is this?" she asked. "It's from the humans," said another mermaid. "We should take it to Queen Miri." The mermaids swam quickly to their kingdom under the water. They entered the royal palace and handed the bottle to their queen. Queen Miri, the wise and strong leader of the mermaids, took the bottle and opened it carefully. She unrolled the letter and began to read. As she read, her face grew hard with anger. "What a proud, arrogant king," she said to herself. "He doesn't even ask for his son. He commands me. Even if he begged, I would never return Kalo. Never." Her voice echoed in the grand, sparkling hall of the mermaid palace. She stared at the letter for a moment, her anger boiling inside her. Then, with one sharp motion, she tore the letter in two. The pieces floated down through the water, drifting softly to the floor. What Queen Miri didn't know was that Kalo had been watching her. He saw everything, the letter, her anger, and the moment she ripped it apart. His heart pounded as he stepped forward slowly. "Mother," Kalo said, his voice quiet but firm. Queen Miri turned quickly, surprised to see him. "Kalo," she said gently. "Why are you here? How long have you been watching?" "I saw everything," Kalo said, his bright white skin glowing in the dim light. "Who sent that letter? What did it say?" Queen Miri took a deep breath. She swam closer to him, placing her hands gently on his shoulders. "It was from a human king," she said softly. "The king of the world above. He claims you are his son." Kalo's eyes widened in shock. "His son," he said. "But that can't be true. I've never even met him. How can I be his son?" Queen Miri's expression softened, and she began to explain. 15 years ago, I found you floating on the river. You were just a tiny baby. You were crying, and you were sinking into the water. I saved you. I brought you here and raised you as my own. Since then, you have been part of this family." Kalo's heart felt heavy. "If I'm his son, why was I left in the river?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Did my real parents not want me?" Queen Miri's heart ached for him. She gently stroked his cheek. "I don't know why they left you," she said. "But I know this, you are loved here. You are my son. You are part of this family, and nothing will change that." Kalo stood in silence, his thoughts swirling. He felt thankful for the life he had here. Finally, he looked up at Queen Mary and said firmly, "I don't want to go. This is my home. You are my mother." Queen Mary smiled and pulled him into a hug. "You will not go," she said. "I will not let that king take you." Just then, Princess Decca swam into the hall. Her eyes were wide with worry. She had overheard their conversation and quickly swam to Callow. She threw her arms around him. "You're not leaving," she cried. "You're my brother. I won't let anyone take you away." Callow hugged her tightly. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "This is my family, and I belong here." Queen Mary watched them, her eyes full of love but also determination. She swam forward and placed a hand on both of their shoulders. "Callow is staying," she said. "Let the king send more letters. Let him threaten me with his armies. Callow belongs here, and I will protect him with my life." But deep down, Queen Mary felt uneasy. She knew the king would not stop. She could feel it, this was only the beginning. A great storm was coming, one that would test the strength of both the land and the sea. The third day was almost over. The sun was setting, painting the sky red and gold. The air was tense, and both sides were ready for what was coming. Queen Mary and her mermaids prepared themselves deep in the water, their weapons sharp and their hearts steady. On land, King Uju's soldiers stood firm, waiting for his command. Finally, the moment came. The king walked to the river, his steps heavy and full of anger. His armor shone in the fading sunlight, and his men followed behind him, silent but ready for war. The river rippled, and Queen Mary rose from the water. Her presence was strong and commanding, like the river itself. The king's men and Queen Mary's warriors watched in complete silence. The tension in the air was thick, it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. King Uju spoke first. His voice was loud and full of rage. "This is your last chance," he said. "Return my son to me, or I will destroy you, your warriors, and this entire river." Queen Mary's eyes narrowed, but she stayed calm. "You arrogant king," she said, her voice steady. "Is this how you say thank you? I saved the child you call your son. Without me, he would not even be alive." The king's face grew red with anger, but he said nothing. Queen Mary continued. "You demand your son, but you left him to die. You do not deserve him." Her voice turned sharp. "No one wants to make deals with a man like you. But if you insist on taking him, you will have to be more respectful and thankful." King Uju's hands clenched into fists. "Enough of your words," he shouted. "Give me my son, or I will take him by force." Queen Mary stood tall, her voice unwavering. "Your pride ends here, King Uju. Let's settle this now. But we won't let innocent lives be lost in a fight that is ours to settle. This is between you and me." The king paused, his anger boiling over. Then, with a sharp motion, he drew his sword. The blade gleamed in the fading light. "So be it," he growled. Queen Mary stepped onto the riverbank, her movements smooth and powerful. As she emerged from the water, her tail shimmered and transformed into human legs. She reached for her own sword, long and glowing like the waves. Both sides, humans and mermaids, watched in complete silence. They held their breath, their eyes fixed on the two leaders. The king pointed his sword at Queen Mary. "You will regret this," he said through clenched teeth. Queen Mary raised her sword high, her expression calm but fierce. "Your pride blinds you, King Uju. Today, you will learn that even a king cannot control everything." The river was quiet, the air still. Everyone knew this fight would decide everything. And then, with the sun sinking low, the battle began. The mermaids were scared. They watched from the water as Queen Mary fought the king. They knew the king was very strong, and they were afraid she might lose. The king's men stood tall on the riverbank. Although the mermaid had magic, But the king's men practiced dark magic which made them even more powerful. There were so many of them, 10 times more than the mermaids. Queen Miri and the king fought hard. Their swords clashed loudly, and sparks flew with every strike. At first, the king was winning. His hits were strong and fast, pushing Queen Miri back. The mermaids whispered to each other. "The queen is losing," one said softly, her voice shaky. But then, something strange happened. Queen Miri started to fight back stronger than before. Her strikes became faster, her movements sharper. It was like she was getting stronger with every swing of her sword. It's because of Prince Kallo, the power meant for the king's land is now helping her. Kallo's gift is making her stronger. Queen Miri's sword moved like lightning. She pushed the king back until her blade pointed straight at his neck. The king froze, breathing hard. The mermaids watched, holding their breath. It looked like the queen had won. But instead of finishing him, Queen Miri stepped back. She lowered her sword. "I didn't come here to end the life of anyone," she said firmly. "I came to protect my people and the river." The king's face turned red with anger. He stepped back, his pride hurt. Then he began to chant strange words. His voice was low and filled with power. He pulled out a red cloth and tied it tightly around his arm. A dark light started to glow around him, and his power grew stronger. He charged at Queen Miri again. Their swords clashed even harder than before. The fight was fierce. This time, the king was as strong as the queen. He managed to cut her arm. Blood flowed, but Queen Miri didn't stop. She kept fighting, her face full of determination. The king saw his chance. He raised his sword high, ready to strike her neck. This was his moment to win. Suddenly, a loud voice echoed across the river. "Stop!" The voice was so strong that everyone froze. The king's sword stopped mid-swing. Both the humans and the mermaids turned toward the river, their eyes wide in shock. From the water, Kallo appeared. His body was glowing bright. His tail began to change as he stepped onto the riverbank, turning into human legs. He looked powerful, and his glow lit up the entire area. Kallo's voice was calm but firm. "This fight ends now," he said. The ground trembled as he walked forward. The king's men took a step back in fear. The king lowered his sword slightly. Kallo stood tall, his body shining with light, his eyes filled with strength. The river became quiet, and the air was still. Everyone, mermaids and humans, watched in silence as Kallo, no longer just a boy but something far greater, faced them all. His voice was steady but strong as he spoke. "I can't believe someone like you is my father. Thank the gods I didn't grow up in your hands." King Uju's face burned with anger. "How dare you speak to me like that?" he shouted. "I am your father." Kallo didn't back down. "Father or not, I will say what you need to hear. Your pride is what will destroy you. I am sorry, please, and thank you. These are 3 simple but powerful words. I guess you've never said them in your life. These words could stop wars, but you ignore them. Instead, you choose war, even if it means innocent people will die." The king's fists clenched tightly. "Who are you to lecture me?" he growled. "I have lived 3 times longer than you. My wisdom is beyond your understanding. Join me now, and together we will destroy these mermaids." Kallo's expression grew sharp. "Not all advice from an old man is good," he said firmly. "Even fools grow old." The king's body shook with rage. "So, you want to fight your own father?" he bellowed. Kallo shook his head. "I am not the one fighting. The queen is." Kallo turned and walked toward Queen Miri, who was lying injured on the ground. He knelt beside her and placed his glowing hands over her wounds. A bright light spread from his fingers, and the queen's injuries healed. Queen Miri stood up, taller and stronger than before. Her eyes glowed with renewed power. The king's face twisted in disbelief. He raised his sword and charged at Queen Mary again, but this time, she was faster and stronger. She dodged his attacks with ease and struck back with sharp, precise blows. The king, desperate, turned to his men and shouted, "End them all! Take the lives of all mermaids and poison the river. Leave no one alive." But something unexpected happened. The king's men didn't move. They stood still, their swords lowered. Then, one by one, they dropped their weapons. The soldiers turned to Callow, bowing to him instead of the king. Their loyalty had shifted. They didn't like their king before. They had no courage to stand against him. Now that Prince Callow is present, this gave them courage. The king's eyes widened in shock. "You traitors!" he screamed. "You dare defy me?" His men said nothing. They stood behind Prince Callow. The king's anger exploded. He lunged at Queen Mary, swinging his sword wildly. But she was too strong. Her blade moved like lightning, cutting through his armor and slicing his skin with ease. The king stumbled back, blood dripping from his wounds. Queen Mary stood over him, her sword raised high. The entire battlefield went silent. The king looked up at her, fear in his eyes. For the first time, his pride cracked. His voice was shaky as he said, "I am sorry." The silence deepened as Queen Mary froze, her sword still pointed at his neck. Her glowing eyes stared into his, searching for truth in his words. Queen Mary looked down at the defeated king, her glowing sword still pointed at his neck. She sighed and stepped back, lowering her blade. "Now that's it," she said. "Did those words take anything from you? I am sorry, it's so simple. You are lucky my blade didn't move too fast." She held out her hand and helped the king to his feet. King Uju stood there, silent and ashamed. He looked at his men, his own soldiers, and saw how they had turned against him. He thought about his actions, his pride, and how it had brought him to this moment. Slowly, he realized how far his pride had taken him from the man he should have been. The king turned to everyone, the mermaids, his soldiers, even Prince Callow. He bowed his head deeply. "I am sorry," he said again, his voice soft but sincere. "I have been blinded by my pride. I have hurt you all. Please forgive me." The battlefield grew quiet as his words hung in the air. The king's shame was clear. Queen Mary nodded, and Prince Callow stepped forward. "I forgive you," Callow said. His voice was calm but strong. "But let this be a lesson. Kindness, not pride, is what makes a true leader." The armies on both sides slowly began to retreat. The mermaids returned to the water with their queen, their tails shimmering as they disappeared beneath the surface. Prince Callow followed the king back to the palace. Queen Afechi and Prince Arinza was released. When she stepped out and saw her son, tears filled her eyes. She fell to her knees, begging him, "Please forgive me, my son. I was so afraid. I made a terrible mistake." Prince Callow knelt down and gently lifted her to her feet. "Mother," he said, "stand up. I have already forgiven you." He smiled warmly and added, "These has brought me nothing but the happiest moments of my life." The king shaved his hair and looked more handsome. The palace was filled with peace for the first time in years. The king gathered everyone together, his family, his advisors, the chief priest and his soldiers. He stood before them and bowed. "I have been wrong," he said. "My pride blinded me, and I ruled with cruelty. But from now on, I will lead with kindness and fairness. Please forgive me." The people accepted his apology. Even those who had feared him for years forgave him. Queen Mary returned to her kingdom with her mermaids, but she and Callow agreed to keep the peace between the land and the sea. Prince Arinze, who had been adopted into the royal family, was not sent back to the orphanage. He stayed in the palace and became a part of the family. The two princes, Callow and Arinze, grew close like brothers. From that day forward, the kingdom changed. King Uja ruled with kindness, wisdom, and fairness. He became known as one of the kindest rulers in the history of the land. The two kingdoms, the human world and the mermaids, lived in peace, and both prospered. Prince Kalo often visited the mermaid kingdom, where he was loved and celebrated. He also spent time in his father's palace, helping to guide the kingdom to new heights. His presence brought prosperity to both worlds. Years passed, and the king grew old. When it was time, he passed the crown to Prince Kalo. Kalo became the new king, and one of his first acts was to ban the use of dark magic forever. He ruled with fairness, just as he had promised. His story became a legend, told for generations to come, a story of pride, forgiveness, and the power of kindness. And so, peace reigned, and the tale of the boy from the river became the story of a king who united two worlds. Pride and arrogance lead to downfall. In life, the simplest words often hold the greatest power. I am sorry, please, and thank you are not just phrases but bridges that mend broken relationships, end conflicts, and build trust. They reflect humility, gratitude, and respect, qualities that bring people together and create lasting peace. Pride and arrogance may give the illusion of strength, but they lead to isolation and destruction. True strength lies in admitting mistakes, seeking forgiveness, and showing appreciation. A leader, or anyone, who wields these words with sincerity commands not just power but also love, loyalty, and unity. If you love this story, don't forget to like, share, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more.